Welcome back to Vision Labs. My name is VB Franz, your resident teacher for anything meta related. I actually have a guest with me today. His name is Living Proof. He has a very big YouTube channel as well as a Discord that we will link down below. Proof, how about you go ahead and introduce yourselves to the Vision fans that don't know you, and just let us know about your Spike Brothers experience and Vanguard experience in general.
What's going on, Vision team? Proof here. You can call me Proof, Living Proof, whichever you prefer. I've been playing Vanguard for about 10 years now, basically since it first came out, and a lot of my content is based on Spike Brothers because it's the clan that I really enjoyed the most throughout the first 10 years of Vanguard. And now with OverDress coming out, the deck that I really gravitated towards was Bruce. Obviously, it has the Spike Brothers aesthetic, which I enjoy, but the game, or the way that it plays, really makes me happy as well.
Awesome. And he's very modest. The reason why he is here, the reason why so many people have asked him about his lists, is because he is generally thought of as probably one of the best Bruce players, at least on the East Coast, if not the North America side of the world here. So let's go ahead and jump into this list here. We have the ride line as the basic ride line starter, Steve and Richard, as well as the resident Bruce. Skills pretty simple. We have Steve, when it's placed, you can call a card from your soul charge 1, and then Richard, when you ride, you can put a card from your rear guard to the soul, draw a card, and then Bruce, the Big Daddy Final Rush. Basically, you just need to be on Bruce at the beginning of your turn to activate Final Rush, and then when it attacks, you can Soul Blast 5 and stand your rear guards. Proof, what makes this skill so unique in the metagame right now?
The reason why it's unique is because it's, I guess, the easiest way to achieve 5 attacks. There are other decks that can do it, but it kind of has to jump through a couple other hoops to get there. But Bruce does it just by existing and activating Final Rush, which is easy thanks to the fact that the ride deck is now a thing. So you just sit on Bruce for a turn, and then just make sure that you can achieve 5 soul, which is very easy with the rest of the contents of the deck that we'll touch on. And then just make sure you have some power units around and take advantage of it, then just beat face on your opponent.
Awesome. And about the ride deck specifically, what do you think is like the main focus of that, and how do you basically use it well in your game plans?
So you mainly use it just to get you most of the way to activating Bruce, because through the ride line you get to 4 soul by the time you're sitting on Bruce, as long as you don't run into any type of retire or anything that can disrupt that. But typically you sit on 4 soul, and then you just need to find 1 more by the time you're on your 4th turn, which is very easy to do, and then you can activate Bruce. Another thing that you can do with it is to use your soul as a resource to pay for some of your other skills, and Bruce has a very easy way of achieving 5 soul, even though you do use some soul blasting. So you kind of use your costs and then use that to help fuel you to get forward to make sure that your Bruce turn is most lethal when it happens.
Awesome. And we can just go through the quick ratios of the deck. The Vision team will definitely throw those graphics up on the screen so you all can see it at home. We got the 4 Bruce, pretty standard stuff, and then the 4 support grade 3, which is Marjorie, attacker, helps you get soul, very good card. We'll cover that in just a few seconds. Grade 2 being 4 Eden and 4 Electro Spartan, and then going to the grade 1s, we have 4 Gun, 4 Acrobat Presenter, and 3 Proto Bulb. Grade 1 space is generally the most important, at least I think, because these boosters are really important in the deck. Proof, I'm not sure if you have any different thoughts on that.
Oh no, I definitely agree. It kind of comes down to using your boosters to help get some good damage on your opponent, and the best way to do that is to make sure that your rear guards and Bruce, or whichever Vanguard that you're on, is supported by a booster, because it makes your opponent less likely to protect themselves from that attack. And the higher damage that your opponent is by the time that you're on Bruce or final rushing with Bruce, the more likelihood that you'll be able to win the turn, or at least put your opponent in a position where they lose a lot of hand trying to survive. So that having the boosters around is really important for those reasons.
Awesome. And then rounding out with the triggers, we have a pretty standard. I think a lot of people have gone onto some form of 8 crit, 3 front or draws. We chose draws here, and then they're over trigger proof. Do you have any thoughts about like draws versus front specifically, moving draws fronts up more than 3?
I personally play 4 draw and 7 crit, just because since I'm going to be taking some damage here and there, I like the idea of being able to use a draw trigger to help recoup some cards. 3 versus 4 is kind of so whichever you prefer.
Yeah.
If you want to have the 8 crit to make sure that your Bruce swings are that much more threatening, then definitely go for it. Draws versus fronts, I lean more draws right now because just the fact that you can get extra cards in your hand, and since Bruce is kind of combo-y because it needs certain pieces around at certain moments, the draws are helpful. The fronts do synergize with the restand ability, but I think at the end of the day, I would go more draws than fronts right now.
That's totally fair. All right, let's jump into the three key cards, I believe, that for this deck. And we'll start off with probably my favorite card in the deck right now, and that is Steam Battler Gun. Skill is when this unit is placed on rearguard, you can soul charge one, and then act once per turn, you can soul blast 3 to draw a card. This, in my opinion, is just like whenever I see this card in my hand when I'm playing this deck, especially early, if I'm going first and I see this card in my hand or two, we're off to the races here. Like just being able to call it early, fuel your soul, and as well as recoup its cost in hand, and not have to worry about 5 soul because you have so many other ways to get back to 5. It's one of my favorite cards in OverDress in general right now. Proof, what are your thoughts on like the early aggression and stuff with Gun?
Gun was a surprise development because prior to it, the general idea was to just survive until you're at Final Rush and try to get advantage via Protobulb and Marjorie and things like that. But when Protobulb came out, it's not Protobulb, but when Gun came out, things kind of flipped on its head because we realized that you could actually use your soul aggressively to pay for costs and still achieve Bruce's 5 soul. So opening up with Gun or double Gun makes your early game so much more lethal and threatening because you can very easily just pay the Soul Blast 3, draw a card, which can maybe find you another attacker to use and really put the hammer down on your opponent. And going second, it's a very, very strong rush card. If you open 2 of them, you can actually achieve his Soul Blast 3 on turn 1 before you attack, and then you can end the turn with 6 cards in your hand. So that's pretty cool.
And that's crazy, especially going second. You're getting the first attack. You're also drawing the card off your starter. So being able to get to that 6 cards in hand while getting 3 attacks on turn 2, that can really be crippling to some decks, especially decks like Bastion.
Definitely.
All right. Moving on to the second key card, which I put as Diabolos Boys Eden, even though there is only one boy on this card. Skill says continuous rearguard. If you are in Final Rush, this unit gets power +5. If you stand this unit this turn by a card effect, it gains critical +1. Already, if the skill had ended with that text, this card would still probably be played and still probably be pretty good. Second skill, auto rearguard. When this unit attack hits anything, you can counterblast 1, choose one of your opponent's rearguards, and retire it. This card does so much for the deck, and it does so much for the deck's bad matchups too. Proof, what are your thoughts on this card specifically, and how you want to use it?
Usually, like Eden is one of those cards it's very flexible. You can use it early game, you can use it mid game, and then you can use it to try to close up the damage gap late game when you're final rushing. I like to use it early as being a bully card on my opponent's rear guards to help soften up their hand a little bit and let some of the other cards sneak through with some damage. Especially helpful in the games or in matchups like Bastion or Magnolia, things that swarm the board early or try to swarm the board early. You can definitely put a damper on that by going 2 for 1 with Eden's on hit. And then if it survives, or if you have a backup one, come final rush time, you can still aggressively go into your opponent's rear guards and then restand it with a crit, and then make them may not want to protect themselves from the crit because they might not have the cards in their hand, or they just need the damage or some other reason why.
Yeah. And an underlying value of this card, in my opinion, for at least from what I've seen, is especially if you call it early, on your opponent's turn, like that can soak up like a really valuable like attack for them. Like they seem to target Eden a lot from what I've seen.
Yeah, it's a pretty high priority target just because if it exists for more than a turn, it can start to put some of that soft advantage on you. Like you may gain a couple cards here and there because you save cards because he stuck around, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And moving on to the final key card, this is Upward Acrobat Marjorie. Auto rear guard once per turn. When this unit attacks, if you are in final rush cost, put one of your other rear guards into the soul, draw a card, soul charge 1, and this unit gains power plus 10 until the end of the turn, not battle. This card just, I feel like it does so much, like flexibility wise, letting you use guns for soul blast, letting you just be cavalier with your soul, because if you call 2 of these, you only need to have one extra soul because you're soul charging 4 before the Vanguard swings, and you're getting a 23, possibly 33 with Persona Ride Attacker while you're doing it. Just fields with Eden and this, and then a booster or two. It's some of the most consistently hardest hitting turns in Overdress from what I've seen so far. Proof, what do you like so much about this card?
I really enjoy Marjorie. She's arguably my favorite rear guard in the deck because I feel my final rush turns feel much more stable with her around because she can act standalone as a 23k or 33k body that gives you 2 soul and you recoup a card in hand. So you kind of, it's one of the few, or how do I word this? It's one of the rare soul charge 2s that actually give you a card back in Overdress, which is something you really don't see, and I don't know if they're going to continue to do that, but the fact that you can just soul charge 2, gain 10 power, and draw you a card back so you don't lose out on hand advantage that way is a really potent card. And like I said before, my final rush turns feel so much more stable when she's around, and I feel much more secure in its potential. So I enjoy Marjorie.
Definitely a trend you see in all 3 of these key cards is they generally fulfill more than one purpose, and they generally are very flexible in their uses. Gun being able to be called early as aggression, as well as recoup that soul later and give you sometimes that extra 1 soul that you need later on in the game. Eden basically being able to be called at any time in the game and be good and probably be targeted by your opponent on their next swing. And then Marjorie just being a house almost any time that she's on the field, and also being able to soul charge to draw a card, and just in general, it's just such a good card. Now, as always, we will move on to replays. I had given this list to our resident Vision Dummy Spectral to play in the last Vision tournament last week. Did very well, top 8 with it. Very good on them. We will look at, I believe, 2 games from that event to basically show the basic gameplay, game flow, as well as some key decisions in the deck. All right, guys, welcome back. This is replay number 1 out of 2 of the video today. This is Bruce versus Bastion. I actually believe this is the first round of the tournament last week. Proof, what do you think about this opening 5?
This opening 5 is kind of dicey, but it's actually very easy to mulligan it because you don't want to keep the Marjorie because she's not good until turn 4, and since you already have a Bruce in hand, you don't need to keep the second one. And then the triggers are automatic putback for me, so you just chuck 4, keep the 1 Bruce, and then hope to find something that's a little more aggressive, like a gun or an Eden or something like that.
I do think it is possible that there is something that there would be something to say if I was running more than 3 draws to maybe keep the 1 draw in hand as an easy pitch fodder for ride deck. But I can totally see just ditching it, digging more for like gun, Spartans, and Eden, stuff like that. All right, let's go ahead and get this replay going. Does exactly what you say, and draws possibly. No, it's probably a better.
It's a better defensive hand.
That's true. That's true. Still a rough hand overall, though.
Nothing is gonna get through later in the game, that's for sure.
Then we see the opponent throwing back some triggers, stuff, keeping 2 grade 3s in hand, and
necessary.
And in this moment, like opening a gun would be so good against that hand. We do
no doubt.
We do see the Spartan though coming off the top, which makes his hand definitely a lot more bearable.
Definitely makes it a little bit easier to be aggressive because against Bastion, you really want to take advantage of those heavy grade 3 hands early and really put the pressure on them.
Now, like early game guarding and like mid game guarding against Bastion, what are you like trying to accomplish pretty much?
I'm trying to just keep as much action in my hand as possible and try to keep my damage low potentially.
Mhm.
Like I probably would still take the first damage, especially knowing that I had Spartan in hand to get those 2 soul charges in, and the crit kind of just happens and kind of is what it is. But especially if you drew a gun off of that, you would have definitely had a lot of high pressure turn there with the 2 soul charges coming in from Spartan plus the one from gun. So I support taking that early damage is just to make sure, and like it keeps open for Eden, things like that, so you don't get locked out of that if you need it in the future.
Yeah. And like specifically like before their grade 3 turn, or like are you trying to stay below 3 damage?
Yeah, that's a good call there because you can soak up a couple damage there, and you don't want to be at 4 when Bastion swings because you want to potentially take it and then see what happens with the drive checks. Harder to do that if you're sitting at 4 damage and trying to play around a crit or something like that.
Yeah. We see here just a lone gun helping out against a very lone draw trigger on the opponent's side. I would say this is an okay turn 3, not great, not horrible.
I say we pause it here for a second.
Sure. Go ahead.
I would not have put the Acrobat Presenter behind Gun like Spectral did. I would have put it behind Bruce because it does a couple things, especially leading up for the future turns. And I think we'll see that in a little bit, but having stacked up grade 1s makes a final rush setup a lot more awkward to put together because you're gonna have to retire one of the grade 1s if you're trying to replace it with a power unit. So if the Acrobat was behind Bruce and the Gun was standalone, then the Gun could have at worst hit into the draw trigger unless they hit a trigger and gave the power over there, which kind of is what it is in my opinion. But at least this sets up for a future where it's a less awkward setup, and you get to keep the Acrobat around for potential Marjorie absorption if you need it before or after the Bruce is used.
I totally agree with that. Also being able to force out either a PG or generally a no guard when Bastion's at 2 or possibly even 3 damage is super valuable. Because right here, just swinging 13 to 10, they can just use the 15k that they have in hand to 2 pass it. So, all right, we can go back in 3, 2, 1.
Take that, no trigger. Never punished.
True. And you see here, they do get the 2 pass there.
And that's where the Acrobat would have paid off there, just be able to put them to 4, and then the Gun would have been 18 versus, at worst, the hitting off the draw trigger.
Yep.
And against Bastion, it's not too terrible. There is an argument to keep Bastion at 3 damage here, but if you're already being aggressive, then I say go for it. The downside of putting the Bastion at 4 is the double Alden or Alden plus Judgment Sword order play.
Yep.
But if you're threatening final rush lethal next turn, I say push it and see what happens.
Yeah, I think generally when you're going first, unless you have just none of the gas at all, I think you're generally trying to push as much damage into Bastion's face as possible.
Agreed. Play the Alden, and then easy setups, call out Fasado.
Yep. Good cards all around.
And
now,
then here,
how do you usually think about guarding Bastion turns like this?
Typically, I'll let the first one hit if it goes face, because I'm at 2 damage in this situation, and then I'll contemplate based off of the trigger or not what I'm gonna do with the Bastion swing. Generally, I'll probably let Bastion hit if I'm still at 3 damage, and then guard the last 2. Because I'll be sitting at like 4 or 5 after that, which is spooky, but you also save a lot of guard for the following turn where it'd be much more needed.
Yeah, I totally get that. Most like a Persona ride turn is going to be fairly big, so taking some early damage here really helps.
So like kind of like here, I would have taken that first one, hit the trigger, and then contemplated no guard in the Bastion, and then they would have hit nothing.
Yeah.
So give and take, a couple give and take there. Intercepting with the Spartan was smart, in my opinion.
I would agree. In this
And
in that situation though, with that hand, I'm not sure if I would, just because of how little gas I have in hand.
yeah, that's true. That's fair. You kind of have to weigh it based off of hoping that your top decks are good, because then at worst Spartan is a
Mhm.
20k attacker.
But Spec is better than me, so he just top decks Marjorie and Eden like a god.
And then uses gun, which isn't a bad idea because you have 4 soul charge on the board already. And then kind of what I talked about the previous turn, he had to sacrifice the gun for the greater good to make
Yep.
Eden a possibility. If we had gone with my previous setup, then the acrobat would have been behind Vanguard, and then the
Mhm.
gun would have just slid back and made space for Eden.
All right, let's
So it
go
would
ahead and
save the
pause it
card in
here.
the hand.
So in this board setup,
Hmm.
what is your attack pattern looking like? At least the first three swings.
So with Bastion being at with Bastion being at 3 and low on cards, I probably would play a middle ground here of playing around like worst case scenario of an over trigger happening, because if over trigger happens, kind of just ends the whole turn, especially if you see it here. So I would probably go Eden into Fasado
Mhm.
and force them to use 10k shield to stop it, which, as we know, an overdress 10k shield either means a trigger, or as we can see Coco Bell in hand, which is exactly a 10k shield.
Mhm.
And then after that, depending on what my opponent does, I'll swing Marjorie into face to push them to 4 damage. And then Bruce would swing and restand the front row, and then Eden would restand with a crit, and then Bruce would threaten with a crit, and then if they block it with the PG, and then if you do check a crit, you can pass it over to Marjorie.
Yeah, I I,
And for the
I,
crit,
I I completely agree in that sentiment. As you'll see, I believe that Spectral actually doesn't follow this specific pattern. Doesn't get punished, but doesn't follow that pattern. I do believe that our Proof and I's pattern does work out the better here. You start in 3, 2, 1.
yeah,
Yes.
it's kind of like things to keep in mind with overdress is if they over trigger here, how terrible is the rest of my turn?
Yep.
Because until you see it, it's always a looming threat.
We do see the Eden going into face here instead of a facade. Doesn't get punished with the trigger though.
You could argue it'd probably be better to risk it there, because then if they see the trigger, it's out the way. So if it's a heal or something, you can still threaten with a crit.
Mm-hmm.
I guess either way will still work out in the end.
Yeah. And now we have the Marjorie going to face. We have the Vanguard going into face now. In the end, looking at the hand that Caliber has, it doesn't really matter. But still, that's the first game. I think it definitely shows how good Gun Spartan is on turns 1 through 3, as well as how defensively that Bruce can play by taking a decent amount of damage early, keeping stuff in hand, and just going for a longer game later. Proof, how do you feel about that game overall?
I thought it was solidly played. Like, yeah, there's a couple things here and there I would have done differently, but that doesn't mean that the end result could not have been achieved with the similar fashion here.
Mm-hmm.
So all in all, I think it was solid gameplay.
Yeah, and he definitely achieved that in a very similar fashion, finishing the game with 4 damage and two PGs and an overtrigger in hand. So
Yeah, so he was ready in case anything bad did happen on this final push rush turn.
yeah, all right. All right, welcome back to game 2. I believe this is round 5. Actually, I do think at this point, I think this was either the last round or the second to last round. At this point, I think that Spec was X2. On the very bubble of making it to top 8.
For sure.
Yeah, it really was. So let's go ahead and jump into this game. Proof, what do you think about that mulligan right there?
For this mulligan, I would keep the acrobat and toss the other 4, because similar to Marjorie, Protobulb doesn't do anything until turn 4. So get it out the way and try to find something that's a little more action based.
All right, we have the Rancor Ride. Now, actually, a question for your early game against the Stoicheia decks, because I do know that Magnolia also runs this ride chain sometimes. When you see the ride chain here, are you specifically thinking it's Zorga? Are you thinking it's Magnolia? Like, what are your thoughts when you're playing against that?
I never assume until I see a couple other cards come down.
Mm.
In this case, I don't agree with what Spec did for the attack setup of calling out the Acrobat where he did.
Mm-hmm.
I personally would have kept it in hand because it's an important booster for later, and not knowing if it's Magnolia or Zorga kind of exposing my hand to being rushed down like this, and they can pop off some rear guard, especially with my hand being kind of lackluster the way it is. I would have held on to that Acrobat just a little bit longer.
Especially since both Zorga and Magnolia have very good turn twos.
Right, because they can both rock a Linia, which can just put a whole lot of pressure on the board really fast. Get a nice 2-for-1 board swing going your way, especially with Admantis.
And as you see here, just like on turn 2, setting up a 20, 25, 28k line, hitting a crit, it's pretty rough.
Yeah, it's scary. And then if the Zorga player played a little more defensively and swung at rear guards, it really would have put Spec in a pretty bad spot.
Mm-hmm.
But it went all face, all about that action. Unfortunately, drew the over trigger, but you know what? In this case, it isn't all bad.
No, it's actually probably a decent draw for him because Zorga, being a 3 attack deck, just has big numbers. So just having a PG in hand and also having a basically 1 card PG in hand is very good too.
As we see here, like the turn was just pretty lackluster, and this would have been a good time to put the Acrobat behind Vanguard just to make sure you play around a trigger guard no pass situation, especially when you had 2 other swings that needed a trigger to hit. So that's the only thing I would have done differently so far was to hold the Acrobat and place it behind Vanguard, especially because Zorga currently can't retire it. It would have been relatively safe back there.
Yeah, we do see the very bold go into 5, getting a nice timed heal trigger there, and then I'm not sure why the Zorga player let the gun survive. Like I don't think you're really stopping Bruce from getting to 5. If they have it, they have it. So I definitely would have swung into the gun there.
Yeah, I was surprised they decided to go rear guard there instead of just continue pushing face, because you've been pushing face for so long. At some point, I was like, just keep.
And there you see the con of Bruce being the turn 3 play being very lackluster, and then going into the con of Zorga being if you don't have orders, your turn kind of sucks.
I don't remember how much soul Spec had, but it's like he couldn't make it to 3 to use the gun, which having double margin in hand, I definitely would have leaned on if I could have achieved it, but he just missed out on it.
Now I'll stop it once Spec gets his full field set up and goes to battle phase. Okay.
Okay.
So I do see the Spartan coming down as well as the gun. I do believe he actually uses the gun here. Yeah.
Okay. Not a bad idea because you got Soul Charge 4 incoming.
So now going into his battle phase, how do you like this setup? How do you like how he handled that turn?
I think it's the best he could have achieved because Edens don't do a whole lot against Zorga, so fielding the 1 that's in hand prior to using the gun draw, I don't think it was necessary. Because even if you chop down a Zorga field, they can pretty much bring it back relatively easily and quickly thanks to Alchemy Magic, depending on how they use Alchemy Magic. Yeah. So I think going more power-based and resource-based with the Marjorie was the better play. And setting up the field the way he did is perfectly fine, especially because you're likely he's going to be using both Marjories to absorb both units on the board, so they are inconsequential to the end goal here. So just kind of use them for their soul and then get them out the way.
The other line of play that I believe he could have done would have been just keeping the other Marjorie in hand until after he had drawn with the gun, and then possibly thinking about calling the Eden there and going for a 2-crit play. I like the play, getting cards back in hand, just pushing some regular damage, and then having Edens for next turn if they need it. I like it. I think it's the better play. So. All right.
Yeah, there is cause for saying to go with the Eden play, especially if you could have lined it up with the gun Marjorie side, because I believe you had the ability to do that, but pulled the trigger on play of the Marjorie fairly quickly. So then you could have went Eden into Vanguard, force for some guard, and then Marjorie and the Vanguard put him to 3. And then if Bruce hit a crit, he still could have passed everything over to Marjorie's side, because then if Bruce hits, then you still would have had two crit rear guards reach.
All right. So we'll continue with this battle phase in 3, 2, 1, now. And then he's using the boosted Marjorie to suck up the Spartan, and then he's going to, I'm assuming, use the other Marjorie to eat up the gun. Great ordering there. Fairly generic ordering, but still getting the job done.
Hit no triggers there, so these Marjories are max threats.
And that's just what this deck does too. It just like it's like a buzzsaw through a big hand like that.
Yeah, it could chop down a massive hand fairly quickly. Like they used 2 premier guards there to make sure that they didn't die this turn.
And swinging with the 2 crit rear guard first, very good, very good. Love it, love to see it.
I am kind of surprised they guarded so heavily there, but I guess it makes sense in the context of not sitting at 5, assuming that they'll survive this turn, and then you can bring them back either through Zorga or condensation.
Yeah, so essentially that was just them using a 20k guard pretty much because they needed the space to call Hendrina anyway to decrease the soul, and then just call it right back with condensation.
And then this is kind of like taking advantage of Zorga being a 3 attack deck.
Yep.
So this one being 50.
PGs, yeah.
Yeah. Not super scary when you have 2 PGs in hand.
Yep. Especially since you know you're getting the 5 attacks off next turn. You saw the drive checks, one of them being a condensation. This is all but over, except for like possible over trigger, or the quintessential 5th damage draw into 6 damage heal.
Ah, the classic. So that's proper ordering. No, never mind. They did it differently than I thought they would. So if we want to pause it here, we can talk about that for a hot second.
So the way first swing?
Yeah, the first swing. The way the first swing could have been ordered with the Marjorie Proto Bulb setup is that Spec could have used assuming he didn't care about giving up the booster, he could have used Proto Bulb to absorb the Eden and then grab something from Soul, maybe a PG or something. And then he could have used Marjorie to absorb the Proto Bulb before guard is assigned, and then use her skill to soul charge, draw, soul charge, and then it should be 23k instead of 31. But he could have did that as a lineup play, assuming he thought he couldn't win this turn and wanted to survive just a little bit longer. So those are things you kind of have to weigh, especially with your deck being so low. It's like, can I win this turn if I don't do it? And then can I survive the next turn if I don't win this turn? So just a couple things here and there to consider when you're line up your order of swings with Bruce.
Personally, I think that attack, what you said, is just strictly correct in this specific instance in this specific game, because you are playing a 3 attack deck. So getting a PG back when you're at 5 damage is so incredibly important for if they do some like over trigger or healing nonsense, because you know what's in their hand. You know it's a trigger, and you know it's in order. So 31 versus 23 against Zorga is essentially the same number, because they're just going to use the order and then use their intercept to guard the 31. Whereas for 23 they would just use the trigger. You're leaving 5k on the board, but in a 5 attack deck that's hitting 23 plus on almost most of its attacks, sitting at while Zorga's sitting at 4 damage, generally I think is just a better play, especially since you're getting a PG in case some bad things happen.
Yeah, I can agree with that. And then if they were to live and you'd be low on deck, you still have rear guards that might be able to punch through.
Yep. All right, restarting now. And you actually see they draw a PG off of Marjorie, so they would have 2 PGs in hand.
Half of the classic 5th damage draw.
Yeah. Don't you just love
So
it when you're at like 5 versus 4 and then you heal to give them a chance to go to heal on the fifth swing?
I hate it. I hate it. I always my body just seizes up like natural instinct.
All the clench, and it's
Yep.
like just takes the damage, that doesn't let him go. I think this is a great example of like Bruce being able to recover well from being rushed down with just the amount of like resource generation it has. Gun being a great card, Marjorie being a great card. Just in general, I think it really showcases those two cards off.
Yeah, like this was the highlight for Marjorie being a standout card because something I didn't touch on in the beginning was how the fact that she can just be active turn over turn if your opponent doesn't remove her. Unlike Colossus, which is a 1-turn burst option, Marjorie's always going to be a 23k threat or 33k threat on Persona Riot turns because her skill is always looming out there if she's around.
All right, so now that we have the replays out of the way, Proof, I want to ask you the tough question here. Is it better than Bastion?
In my opinion, I say yes. I think Bruce is the better deck, arguably best deck currently right now because it can play a more comprehensive game from start to finish than Bastion can. Bastion is kind of locked into the fork call, trying to generate some type of advantage. The fact that you have so many grade 0 triggers in deck, that means more times than not it could be a bad card to call, so your turn 2 is going to be pretty lackluster. Unlike Bruce, which can have a very explosive turn 2 with Gun, Spartan, Eden. And then you kind of steamroll that into, you have a vanilla turn 3, but Bastion has a vanilla turn 1 and turn 2 into an explosive turn 3. Bruce kind of has a potentially explosive turn 1, turn 2 into a vanilla turn 3 into a very explosive turn 4.
Yep.
And to me, that kind of sets it over the top in terms of what the better deck is right now.
And I can definitely see that. It's really hard for me at this point. Since I love Bastion, I love Bruce. These are some of my favorite decks to play in the meta right now. I can't put one over the other right now. Like I've played both. I played both extensively, and it's just each deck does so many good things that the other does or doesn't do. It does things better than the other deck does, and it's really hard for me to definitively say which one's better. I think it's very, very dependent on what your local area meta is going to be.
Yeah, that's fair. Like, to me, those two are the clear top of the food chain right now, and kind of where you place one above the other is totally dependent on what you're looking for and how you're evaluating what the decks are doing.
Now, second question that kind of goes off this: 2 best matchups, 2 worst matchups for Bruce specifically.
The 2 best matchups, kind of came at me sideways with that one.
Oh yeah.
I think the best matchups right now for Bruce are Bastion, ironically, because the fact that you can take advantage of their hand being kind of poopy early on. And then I guess you could say Prison, because you really don't care about the Prison that much if you use this particular setup of Bruce, because they'll lock down, say, Gun, you can bring back Gun and get a soul charge back, and you'll hardly ever run out of resources to keep beating the Prison down. The 2 worst matchups, I think, ironically or funny enough, one of them is Eugene, because Eugene has such free retire, and combine that with the fact that they could be very aggressive, really eats through the Bruce hand to where they may not have enough to make it over the top. The other worst matchup right now, that one's tough because he has a really wide array of good matchups. Maybe Orphis, I want to say, because Orphis can be similar to Eugene. It can be very aggressive early, and then they don't really care about their hand going down. They'll just generate shadow tokens and continue to put the beats on you. But that one's kind of close. I have to think on it a little bit more, but gun to my head right now, making a decision, I'd say Eugene and Orphis are the two inferior matchups for Bruce at the moment.
All right, that's fair. And now, last question. In your opening hand, give me some specifics that you're looking for, either a combination of cards, like a specific card in general. Like, what are you trying to mulligan for?
I'm trying to mulligan for Gun, Eden, Electro Spartan, Bruce, Those are the main four things. Because if I can find like a gun and a Spartan, then my turn 2 is going to be super explosive. If I find double gun, then it could potentially be very explosive. The dream is getting like double gun, double Spartan, and your opponent gives you 2 damage to work with, because then you can just make a full board and Soul Blast 6 and not have a care in the world.
True.
But beyond that, then yeah, you want those main 4 cards, and if you could find like an tuck behind Vanguard and go and give you some soul charge, then you're sitting pretty fine there.
Awesome. Well, it was great having you, Proof. Very, very glad that you can come on, talk through some of these replays as well as the deck with me. Do you have any other last words for the Vision fans out there?
Thanks for having me. I really hope you enjoyed. I would love to come back on and do some more things like this if you'll have me. So as long as you enjoy it, well, definitely make it happen. You can always find me in my Discord channel. You find me on my personal channel, my Twitter. I'm pretty active around mainly my Discord, so if you ever want to just pop in and say hi, definitely feel free.
Awesome, and we'll link all those down below. If you guys enjoyed this video and you enjoyed having Proof on, if you want to see him more on Vision Labs, some Table 500 stuff, if you want to see him commentate some Vision tournaments, maybe, let us know down below in the comments. Let us know in our Vision community server, and we can absolutely try to make that happen. All right, signing out, guys. Have a nice day.